Hello, everybody, and it's very nice to be with you again. This is Kieran back with you for topic number 9, and it's 9b is the second part of this topic on facilitation. So the learning objectives of this topic are: what are the purposes of facilitation, what are the principles, what to watch out for, and how to plan a facilitation session, and managing conflict. And in this particular unit here, this particular presentation, we're going to be looking at planning a facilitation session. And this is coming from a kind of a practical point of view about how do you actually plan and run a facilitation session. And planning is very important. You need to plan your facilitation because not the same approach and the same mechanism won't work for every facilitation event, and it's important that you are well prepared and that you're clear on what you're trying to achieve and the nature of the organization or the unit that you're doing it for. So some of the planning matters that you need to think about are the purpose of the facilitation, the nature of the group that you're facilitating, that's a really important one, the setting, because that can have impacts as well, your own knowledge of the matter being facilitated, because that will have an impact on how you approach the facilitation and the structure of the facilitation. So there are some of the things that you need to be thinking of when you're planning your session. The purpose of the facilitation is very important, and it can be a variety of different reasons, and indeed it can be a mix of reasons or a mix of purposes, and it's very important that you agree this in advance with the people that you're doing the facilitation for, so that you're all on the same page about what the outcome is. And it can be to agree on the basic purpose and structure of the enterprise. It can be as fundamental as that, and of course that could be at the very beginning when the enterprise is being put in place, or it could be as it reaches more maturity, because as an organization develops and goes on its right to review every so often, should it still be doing what it set out to do at the start? Have things changed? Has the environment changed? And so on. So it can be for that purpose. It can be to develop a strategy, which is a very common use of facilitation processes, because ultimately a strategy is a strategy of the organization, not of the facilitator, but the facilitator can certainly help the organization in putting it together. Develop the team. It could be the board or the management or the staff or all of them together. And again, that's an important consideration. Could be there to resolve an issue, which is a very specific kind of purpose of facilitation, and is sometimes used as a kind of a mediation type mechanism. Or it could be just to review the performance of the organization overall. And again, one of the things that an external facilitator can do in those circumstances is it can ask questions that maybe it would be difficult to be asked internally. Another very important part of facilitation, particularly in the strategic kind of end, is the facilitation about gathering information, gathering viewpoints, gathering ideas, or is it aimed at reaching decisions? Because if it is aimed at reaching decisions, then you need to take a different kind of an approach. As I say, it's important that the purpose of the facilitation and the outcomes that are expected from it are agreed at the very start, and that you're clear on them, and that those you're doing the facilitation for are clear on them. Because one of the worst things that can happen is that you do your facilitation exercise and your clients aren't happy with it, and the problem is that they and you had different understandings of what the facilitation was all about. So that's one of the first things you need to do, is to make sure that everyone is on the same page. Now, the second thing that's important to consider is the nature of the group. And there are various aspects of this that are worth considering. So the first one is the group one that has a lot of knowledge and skill? I mean, are they very familiar with the topic area? Are they very familiar, let's say, with the business area, with the business? Are they very competent in that area? Because if they are, then you will take one type of approach. If they're not, you might take a slightly different approach. Is the organization open and ready for change? Are they entering into this exercise with open minds and with an understanding that change may be required and that change may come out of the process? Is it a cohesive set of people, or are there various groups or factions or viewpoints within the group that you're dealing with, because again, that it does give rise to slightly different approaches. Is there a strong leadership? So do people feel that there's strong leadership, that the organization is being well managed, well directed, that it isn't drifting? Or is there a sense of uncertainty and a sense of unhappiness in the organization? Or is there a domineering leadership? Is it a kind of a circumstance in which the leaders overpower everybody else, really don't want to hear what anybody else is saying, and they're making all the decisions themselves with no reference to anybody else, either in the community or in the organization? So all of these kinds of factors can impact on how you approach the facilitation, and they're ones that you can need to suss out in advance to the greatest extent that you can, without, of course, creating difficulties. So in general, just as a kind of on a summary kind of a basis, if the group is competent, open and well led, then your role can be one which is more about giving guidance, feedback, confirming consensus, and it's kind of you're more like a stimulant more than that. And really they do all the work. You are only a kind of a oil, you're the oil in the wheels. You're not really trying to make things happen. Sometimes they talk about it in rowing terms, in that you're steering, not rowing. But in other contexts, where the group isn't so competent, where it's not so well led, where there is uncertainty and there is division, you may then need to be a bit more interventionist in your facilitation role. And now, not to be overpowering in any sense, not to try and make them do things they don't want to do, but doing things like, for example, providing suggestions, making sure everybody has a chance to speak and that everybody does speak, making sure one dominant voice doesn't stop opinions being expressed, and trying to make sure that when people agree to something ultimately, or when they come to a consensus, that is real, and it isn't just a nominal consensus, and that people aren't saying they agree just for the sake of it, and in order to make sure that the process moves on, so that they are expressing an agreement that they don't really have. So that's another you may need to intervene in all those kinds of areas if the circumstances require it. So the setting is another important kind of consideration for all of this, and sometimes you don't have any choice over the setting, and it can be more difficult, and you need to try and maximize the good qualities of the setting. So if there's conflict in the group, it's important to make sure the setting is neutral. So you don't have it in, say, one of the sections, or you don't have it in one of the offices of one of the protagonists. That the facilitation needs to be in a neutral venue and off-site, away from the organization if necessary, and you can suggest all these things. Some other just general considerations about settings and about how you plan the setting for a facilitation session is, it shouldn't be too small, because especially, and again, if there's a bit of conflict in the group, people being on top of each other doesn't help. People feel crowded, they feel pressured, and that doesn't help the mood of the meeting. No top table. Where you end up with this idea of a top table and then everybody else, and this division between the kind of management and the staff, or this division between one group and the other group, or the chair at the top table, and that's not good for a facilitation session. It may be okay for other purposes, but not for a facilitation session. Round or square tables, and smaller tables if it's a big group. One of the reasons for the round or the square tables is so that people can all engage directly with each other by sight, so that they're sitting in circumstances in which they can all engage. Where you have long rectangular tables, the people at the both ends of the long sides find it difficult to engage with each other, and they find it more difficult to participate, and you will find it a bit more difficult to get everybody engaged. So round or square tables, get rid of that kind of idea, and smaller tables where people can hear each other. All of this is important. You need to be thinking of these things. have breakout rooms available. Sometimes, again, with bigger groups or even relatively small groups, but certainly with bigger groups, you need to break the discussions down into smaller groups in order to ensure that everybody gets a chance to have their say, that there can be good dialogue. Very hard to have good interaction with a group of 20 people. Whereas when you have 5 or 6 people, you can certainly get a good conversation going and everybody can feel that they have an opportunity to be involved. Making sure there are ways of recording outputs and agreements, like either paper or electronic, so that the outcome of the meeting is written down at the meeting and ideally agreed at the meeting, so that there's no backsliding later on about the outcomes. Refreshments and opportunities for informal networking, nearly always very important. This informal networking sometimes can produce quite a bit of the positive outcome of an engagement, and very, very much worth thinking about those kinds of things as well. And I just put in, just in our modern days, I just put in something there about hybrid models of meetings. That is the online type meeting, with some people coming in online and some people being there together in a room. That doesn't work very well for facilitation. Very effective for certain types of meetings and should be used more than not for those types of meetings, but certainly not for a facilitation type event, and is extremely difficult on the facilitator, and it becomes almost impossible to do that well. Going back to the purposes then again of facilitation, this is a kind of another way of thinking about the purposes. So it can be directive, in the sense of giving people information, instructing them how to do things, but it's more, it is more saying there are realities in your arises, is, for example, where there are regulatory matters, and the purpose of the facility board with the regulatory matters. The point about that is there is no discussion about the regulatory, and people have to be told that, and they have to be told what the interpretation of the regulation is, what you're looking for them, and what the session is looking for is how is that applied in practice in this organization. Exploratory to that extent, but to the extent that you're talking about something that is absolute. Exploratory then is the other one. That's where you're asking questions, encouraging people to voice their, trying to bring out the experience that people have, and particularly not trying to say the viewpoints and what do people feel. It can be about delegating. It can involve what, and where are particular responsibilities going to lie, and who's going. And then participative, that's slightly different. That is kind of taking part in the discussions. So you are giving your opinion as well as hearing the opinions of people to share theirs, and it's that kind of engaged and ongoing discussion. So there can happen, and the kind of purposes that are involved. I talked about, and I would just say, if the group has good knowledge of the topic and you don't, more exploratory, more into the kind of summing up, the investigating, are you getting it right? Is that correct? Do people agree with that? And so on. But if they don't have good knowledge, well, then you can be much more participative and you can engage with the discussion, and you know about this topic. And I know that for this to work well, it has to go. That goes back to that regulatory kind of stuff I was talking about earlier. If both participatory and non-directive, if you know what I mean. So you can engage in the discussion, you can give your opinions, but you can definitely leave it up to the group to make their own decisions, because they have that knowledge. And then if neither you nor the group has good knowledge of the topic, something that I should be taking on at all, because this may not turn out to be a good experience. talking about. How are we going to get a good outcome from this? So again, if you're asked to take on something that you're not particularly comfortable with, or that, so one of the important things in planning the facilitation then is, I would always say you should have a structure in your mind, but don't be a slave to it. Sometimes facilitation their own life, and you have to kind of go with that direction, because trying to drag it back into a can be quite disruptive, and it can undermine the whole session and its effectiveness. About having a structure, but being flexible in how that everybody has agreed is what you're trying to get to. A basic structure might be by the chair, introductions, hopes and fears for the session from everybody. As expected. Outline the structure of the session, including some context perhaps, to get the discussion off the ground. And then, or altogether, depending on the overall size of the crowd. So you're saying to them, okay, here are some things I want you to answer when you're having your discussion. Feedback to the overall is needed. And then you do those steps 5 to 8 for other topics. And then at the end, you have a review and confirm the decisions reached. Ask if anyone has any comment or an issue. Provide and gather some evaluation sheets, and then at closing by the chair. So it's that kind of a structure will often apply for many facilitation type sessions. Sometimes you have to consider as well your role and the role of the chair. If the group has a strong chair, they may be used to managing the group activities, and they may not deliberately but inadvertently almost start to try to do the facilitation. So agree with them in advance that they will hand the session over to you, and they will say it specifically that I will now hand it over to X and ask them to run this session, and they'll be an ordinary member of the group. They can introduce the session and close the session so that their position isn't undermined, but that's just but that should be their only involvement in that kind of a role. And ask everyone to raise any questions through you as well, not through the chair. Tends to happen anyway, but just no harm to say it just to make sure that it does happen. And just some of the things to watch out for before and during the session, so that it doesn't cause any difficulties. Race and ethnicity, age, disability, sexual orientation, movement, dress, and boundaries. All of those kinds of things you need to have them in your head, and so to make sure that there is sensitivity to those things, and that that things aren't done inadvertently that cause difficulty around any of those situations, and that the structures and the structure of the session, doesn't impinge badly on particular races or ethnicities or ages or people with disabilities or anything like that. Consider what dress is appropriate. Varies from circumstance to circumstance. Sometimes a more formal type of dress is required if you're in a more formal situation. Sometimes informal is better if you're in an informal session. And that's basically it. There's some additional reading for you. So there's a conflict management styles quiz, pros and cons of using internal and external facilitators, and what is a business facilitators, and a quiz and a video there on that as well. So there's quite a bit of stuff there for you, and I hope you'll read that as well, and that this session was of benefit to you.